run out to tell others. To your surprise, in a myriad of manners, they ignore you, they deny you, they dismiss you. Your vision of the coming apocalypse sharpens. You raise your voice, you scream, you run out to the square and yell, but the more shrill you get, the more they ignore you. Tipping point. It might drive you crazy. It did drive poor Cassandra insane. In the Greek myth, Apollo gifted her, malevolently, with the power of prophecy and the curse of being ignored. And she shares the vision to no avail. Wild-eyed and pulling her hair, she descends slowly into tortured madness. Only when her prophecies come true does anyone admit that she was right. She laments, "They called me once the prophetess of lies, the wandering hag, the pest of every door. Attest ye now she knows in very sooth the house's curse, the storied infamy. Woe for me, woe, again the agony, dread pain that sees the future all too well, with ghastly preludes, whirls, and racks my soul." So are modern environmental activists Cassandras? Well, Bill McKibben, author of The End of Nature and Earth, has been warning us for decades, talk after talk, article after article, about this looming ecological catastrophe. He worries it isn't enough. He sees very little being done to actually avoid what one British environmentalist calls a perfect storm of food and water shortages, not much more than 25 years away. After a trip to Bangladesh, where McKibben saw the deadly effects of climate change already hurting the poorest of the poor, he said, quote, "Something in me snapped. It would be bad enough if this was an accident," McKibben laments, but, quote, "it's no accident. Given how we set up our economic and political system, this is how it's going to happen because we set it up this way." Now, this same frustration has affected mild-mannered Al Gore. Last August, Gore gave a speech in which he lapsed from his sort of flat persona into as close as he can get to a Cassandra-style madness. In critiquing the disinformation campaigns that deny global warming and distracting us from saving the planet, Gore said, excuse the cursing, "They pay pseudoscientists to pretend to be scientists to put out the message, this climate thing, it's nonsense. Man-made CO2 doesn't trap heat. It could be volcanoes. Bullshit. It may be sunspots. Bullshit. It's not getting warmer. Bullshit." Gore continued to rail, "It's no longer acceptable to mention in mixed company, meaning bipartisan company, the word climate." Of course, Al Gore is angry. The dismissal of fact by a vocal minority and the gullibility of so many that believe them is particularly galling for somebody so dedicated to science. It's the theme of his book, The Assault of Reason, in which he bemoans the trend in U.S. policy towards ignoring facts. We need the best science when making public policy about the fate of the earth. Science that's evolving and pragmatic and admits its mistakes. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. Well, we here at the Ethical Humanist Society of Philadelphia, we like facts. We don't think truth comes from supernatural clairvoyance of Greek myths or from revelation from on high. We believe that careful empirical research and public discourse gets us closest to the facts. Now, I am not a scientist. Everything I say today should be questioned and thought about. I'm exploring here. I'm doing the best I can. This was the hardest platform to write. Well, what is science and the facts that it's accumulated told us? They tell us that human behavior is affecting climate change, and that's affecting the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. The degree is up to debate. Most of you know these facts. Now, Bill McKibben started an organization called 350.org that we supported based on the estimate of how many parts per million of CO2 can be in the atmosphere before ecological devastation begins. Many scientists believe that that level is 350 parts per CO2, after which we begin to degrade the environment. Currently, according to many estimates, we're at 392 parts per million, with plenty of researchers saying that 400, 500, and 600 are only a few years away. Now, this rise is caused by the fact that the average American, like you and me, burns 25 barrels of oil a year. That's 8 billion barrels just in the United States alone. Add all the natural gas and all the coal we burn, and all the fossil fuels burned by everybody else on the planet, and it's no surprise that the atmosphere is changing. As the CO2 traps the Earth, we're getting hotter. And then the feedback loops kick in. As temperatures rise, Himalayan glaciers and polar ice caps shrink. Ice and frozen land begins to thaw. From below the sea and on top of the tundra, chemicals previously frozen and inert begin to rise as gas. Methane, which traps heat in the atmosphere like CO2, is bubbling up from sludge on the ocean floor. You can see bubbling cauldrons now. The Siberian plains are warming up millions and millions of tons of organic matter that exhale methane. The irony is that the oil companies now can get to the oil reserves in the northern regions more easily to drill for more oil, which increases the feedback loop. Now, rising temperatures can cause sudden and unpredictable rainfall. Unusually heavy rains and tropical storms cause flooding, which leaves reservoirs of spoiling water that breeds mosquitoes. Combined with warmer temperatures, the standing water brings more dengue fever and malaria. In El Salvador, where my 3 children go every summer, cases of dengue fever has increased 20-fold from 2001 to 2007. Water threatens us in another way. As polar ice caps melt and sea levels rise, they menace low-lying areas and island cultures. Century-old civilizations, like in the Maldives or Kiribati, are exploring coping mechanisms to keep the inundation from occurring and planning for mass evacuation. On top of all of this, the human race is still growing, accelerating climate change. Julia Whitry, in a 2012 Mother Jones article, noted that we've achieved what she calls ecological overshoot, a condition where the population is using up more of the world's renewable resources to the point that we are no longer sustainable. And yet, 157 people are entering the world every minute, 153 of them in developing countries least able to support them. They all need potable water, and ironically, while the melting of the polar caps creates more water, that water flows into undrinkable, salty seas. Now, when Howard Peer, a couple of years ago, showed in this room the 2007 BBC documentary Earth, I became more aware of how quickly lakes are shrinking and rivers are running dry, and you can see this on satellite imagery. Some of the world's largest rivers don't even reach the sea during dry seasons. Animals have to travel further to find water. And the lack of water causes wars. The UN Environment Program concluded that water shortages help cause the devastating war in Darfur. The nonprofit British International Alert identified 46 places in the world where water and climate change could ignite violent war by 2025. Okay, have you heard this all before? Am I preaching to the choir? Our eyes glazing over? Yeah. Well, here's McKibben's advice. Don't let your eyes glaze over at this parade of statistics. These should come as body blows, as mortar barrages, as sickening thuds. Now, if one had a Pollyanna perspective, you might say, well, human ingenuity will figure it out. But there's some who claim that this evil genie is already out of the bottle, that there's little we can do to stop the catastrophe, that we've gone by the tipping point, and drastic change is inevitable and irreversible. This is Bill McKibben's reason for naming his book Earth with 2 A's, because he said that we already have changed the Earth so much that it's not the same planet anymore. So new planet, new name. James Hansen, considered by some to be a radical environmentalist, warns us that we ain't seen nothing yet. In his 2009 book, Storms of My Grandchildren, he sees grave consequences of what he called continued greenwashing. That's where we admit that there's a problem, but then don't do anything about it. He asks if our behavior will make the Earth more like a planet like Venus, which has volatile, extreme weather, scorching heat, acidic clouds, constant lightning, and roaring winds. Now that's an apocalypse. All right, so my talk today is not about what we can do. You can spend 10 seconds on the internet and get a list as long as your arm about what you can do. I mean, just go plant a garden, for example. What I want to focus on today is more so why so much of us, including myself, are doing so little. I mean, our ethical action projects that we could choose are multiple, but this seems to be the most important. What does it matter if we marched for civil rights, or lobbied for separation of church and state, or fed the homeless if we lose the planet? Is it due to a lack of imagination? Does the relative continuity of our day-to-day events make us feel safe? You know, oh, climate change, yeah, we hear it all the time, so what? In an article entitled The Ethical Dimensions of Tackling Climate Change, Stephen Gardner points out that most of us know what's going on. He says, quote, "The core problem is that thus far effective action seems beyond us. We seem at best paralyzed and at worst indifferent. Put starkly, there seems little place in our grand institutions and busy lives for what may turn out to be the defining issue of our generation." Well, about a generation ago, in my first years of teaching, I got involved in another issue that I thought was creating mass paralysis about a different imminent danger: nuclear arms. I was teaching Soviet studies as Reagan was cranking up the arms race, and I was listening to Dr. Jack Geiger. Anybody know him? Physicians for Social Responsibility. He was describing what would happen if a relatively small 1 megaton bomb went off in the middle of any urban center in the United States. The catastrophe would be unprecedented, and for me, the most poignant part was that the infrastructure would collapse, so there would be no way to respond to the immense suffering. No nurses, no antibiotics, no way to get to a hospital. So I joined Educators for Social Responsibility. I crafted curriculum, I did workshops, I wrote articles. Meanwhile, most of the world went on doing what they thought they would do every day, and like nothing was happening. And I wondered, what's going on? My first youthful confrontation with this paralysis. And then I read a book called Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell. I was struck by Schell's link between our own mortality and the potential for planetary suicide. What I took from my read was that how difficult it is for us to think clearly about our own individual death. It's hard to imagine the world without us in it. There's a degree of unreality about our mortality that contributes often to reckless behavior and rationalizations for poor lifestyle changes. I mean, we live sometimes as if we can't die. Schell said the human race acts like that. He says, as a species, we don't have the capacity to really visualize a world without human beings. It's hard enough, he says, for a single individual to understand their own mortality, but there's no mechanism to process the potential extinction of the entire human race. No more history. Schell calls this second death. And when this specter arises, so too does a form of what he says is psychic numbing. Psychic numbing. It leaves us unable to act, and we drift towards apathy and isolation and indifference. He may be right or wrong, but he says, at present, most of us do nothing. We look away, we remain calm, we are silent, we take refuge in the hope that the Holocaust won't happen, and turn back to our individual concerns. We deny the truth that's all around us. Indifferent to the future of our kind, we grow indifferent to one another. We drift apart, we grow cold, we drowse our way to the end of the world. Well, I think we're all vulnerable to this psychic numbing. Even a genius who understood the power of the atom was vulnerable to this. Dr. Oppenheimer, who's the scientist who guided the development of our first nuclear bomb development, was unprepared for what was unleashed. Standing in the New Mexico desert, his eyes glowing orange from the mushroom cloud he was watching, he recalled the haunting words of the Bhagavad Gita, "We have become as gods, destroyers of worlds." Now I imagine that in the rest of Oppenheimer's rather troubled life, he was tortured and scarred by what he was potentially responsible for unleashing. So is that what's going on in climate change? Is it all too much for us to imagine? Are we psychically numb? It would be nice, but I think that's too simple. Because there are lots of things going on that I want to explore. So let's examine some other ways denial may be playing out. And again, maybe. This is my exploration. For those on the right side of the political spectrum, sometimes left-wing environmentalists are seen as deluded Chicken Littles saying the sky's falling. In an article last summer called "Chicken Little George Goes on a Tirade," self-satisfied Pittsburgh Post-Gazette writer Jack Kelly gleefully reports Al Gore's frustration about climate change skepticism. He writes, "Mr. Gore can only respond with curses and ever more hysterical predictions of imminent doom. His credibility is in tatters. In the public mind, he has turned from Nobel Prize laureate to Chicken Little." Now, such dismissiveness is made easier because there are conflicts and disagreements within the scientific community and within environmentalism. I mean, for example, Jim Hansen has been criticized for his extreme and dire predictions. Physicist Freeman Dyson, who I respect often quite a bit, claims that Hansen has consistently exaggerates all the dangers and has turned science into ideology. Eileen Clausen, president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, said, "I view Jim Hansen as a heroic scientist, but I wish he would stick to what he really knows because I don't think he has a realistic idea about what is politically possible." But those who use such disagreements to claim that science isn't telling us anything don't know science. It's precisely this sort of open criticism that keeps science honest. In order to build a general consensus over the dangers of man-made climate change, science has to continue examining itself and questioning and re-questioning its assumptions. And such disagreement is very different from what pissed off Al Gore. Just this week in The Inquirer, reporters pointed out a Heartland Institute's intentional disinformation campaign to convince the public that there's no scientific consensus when there is. Consensus does not mean certainty. McKibben points out that Exxon is one of the world's largest contributors to such disinformation. Capitol Hill is swarming with lobbyists. 85% of them on ecological issues are defending the industry, blocking public action on climate change. The motive for most of this disinformation is simply greed. I'm not sure what percentage of people who put out this disinformation really believe it, but certainly most of them are getting rich while they can. Carpe diem, in the most malevolent form of that phrase. Now, if not all deniers are maliciously greedy, some are just saying, well, that's just the way things are. I mean, we kind of can agree, we understand the mindset of people like Ed Legg, who is an Energy Institute lobbyist, who says, we're probably not going to favor anything that shrinks business. All right? Is it fair to say, then, that this is simply the unintended result of a group of people acting in a way that comes out to be tragedy of the commons? Tragedy of the commons is a phrase that applies to when a shared public resource is suddenly unintentionally exhausted by the individual actions of its members. Is that what happened? Jared Diamond, in a great book called Collapse, talks about historical examples of tragedy of the commons. 100 years ago in Greenland, for example, he talks about how a civilization flourished because they had this great wood supply for building of boats, very important to the economy. And each time each person was hacking away in the wilderness, they were just cutting down one tree at a time. And then these Viking lumberjacks suddenly cut down the last tree, and Jared imagines the dumbfounded look on their face when they turn to look for the next tree and they don't see him. And that civilization vanished. Tragedy of the commons. Many climate change skeptics honestly believe their denials. They aren't lying in order to make a buck. They aren't the producers of the disinformation, but they're the consumers of it, who consume it because it's so much easier to think that everything's okay. It's easier for me. Don't worry, be happy, right? There's more movies to see and stuff to buy, and that's what people want if you read the polls. So this explains much climate skepticism in countries where emotional factors and ignorance of the facts keep most of us distracted, most of the time. But many key conservative skeptics, with degrees from the finest educational institutions from the land, actually seem to believe that science can be ignored. So how is this so? Well, previews into an intriguing book due out in May offer one explanation. This is the most contentious part of my talk today. The book is called The Republican Brain, The Science of Why They Deny Science and Reality. The author, Chris Mooney, reveals a remarkable difference that he believes exists between conservatives and liberals. I'm uncomfortable with the labeling of Republican. I still hold out faith of rational, pragmatic Republican Party. Maybe I'm crazy. But Mooney says that a Pew report about the relationship between educational level and attitude towards facts is fascinating. He says that amongst Democrats, the most educated are more likely to process and accept new scientific evidence about climate change. Amongst Republicans, however, he says that the more educated are less likely to accept the same evidence. Mooney says that the mind-blowing conclusion of this is that better educated Republicans were more skeptical of modern climate science than their less educated brethren. Only 19% of college-educated Republicans agreed that the planet is warming due to human actions, whereas 31% of non-college-educated Republicans believe that. He suggests that the more educated conservative Republicans are perhaps more politically sophisticated or skilled in rhetoric and logic and filled with lots of knowledge, but all of it supporting their worldview. They are, he speculates, less able to incorporate new ideas that challenge their assumptions and thus are less persuadable and in the long run, more ignorant. I mean, this explanation helps me process a little bit that moment 4 years ago when I was watching a Republican debate and the moderator asked, is there anyone on stage that does not believe in evolution? And 3 candidates raised their hands. Mooney discusses how people filter scientific evidence about societal risks through their own deeply held cultural values and rejects evidence that contradicts that. Now, liberals and Democrats are not immune to it. Mooney cites a history of liberal resistance to nuclear power that makes it hard for liberals today to hear new facts about nuclear energy. He claims that there is, however, a remarkably less likelihood for people on the left than right to rule out facts that disagree with us. Makes us feel kind of smug, right? What a bunch of snobs. I apologize for the cynicism. I get more jaded now when I go to the next group of people and their attitude about climate change. A bizarre and dangerous attitude, those who welcome it. I'm talking about those waiting for the rapture. Now, way back in 1982, Jonathan Schell noted that the nuclear holocaust was welcomed by fundamentalists that saw it as the Armageddon predicted in the Bible. Among some fundamentalists today, there's a similar attitude about environmental fears. Why worry about this puny planet if the second coming's at hand? This aspect of fundamentalist faith in a spiritual world separate and above the one we live in can have scary results. It doesn't have to, but for many rapturous, it does point towards planetary suicide. So there's no single answer to the question about why we do so little. Sometimes it's because of live-for-today greed, other times active disinformation, psychic numbing over the consequences, consumerist distraction, probably my greatest fault. So they all play a role. So what are humanists supposed to do? Well, I said humanists like facts, and so I think that's where we should go. First, we appreciate that facts have the power to convince, so we should learn them and we should teach them as many people as possible. We should make sure that our public and our public schools are taught these facts. We have to make sure that peer-reviewed, objective analysis is what is taught in our public schools. And this is an unending battle. Demand that objective science is taught. But we know that other people will not be convinced by facts. Facts aren't always enough, even for ourselves. Because how many of us know the facts but aren't doing much? So I want to suggest that all of us individually, in fact the entire human race, simply needs to grow up. Bill McKibben says we need to mature. When we're young, we think we're immortal, and we live as if there are no limits. We grab life with both hands and take all that we can get. And when our parents say no, we get angry because we want more, and we want more, and we want more. Now, when our mortality comes into focus, whether that's at 19 or 90, sometimes we reassess our priorities. When we grow older, our limits become clearer and more poignant. We ease our demand for bigger, better, more, and seek stability or equanimity. I think that has to be the case with the human species. We have to stop treating this planet as limitless. We have to accept its fragile and finite nature. If we're to process the potential of what Jonathan Schell calls second death, that we might end the human race on this planet and maybe in the galaxy, we have to evolve. For me personally, my appreciation of my own limits are essential to my deepest humanist commitments. I hope that by nurturing this appreciation, I've become a little more effective in promoting sustainable public policy, if it's not too late already. Now, to climate change skeptics who don't share my humanist perspective, there are other arguments that I can offer to try to convince them. I can say to them, look, maybe you're right. Not in a condescending way. Maybe you're right. Maybe the climate change predictions aren't correct. Maybe there are things we've overlooked. Maybe there's only a small chance for major climate change. But if that's the case, then I have two other arguments. First, given the horror that environmental collapse would entail, the massive human suffering, the extinction of thousands of magnificent species created by God or nature or whatever your perspective tells you, the potential for life on Earth to end, even if there's just a tiny chance of that occurring, isn't that worth addressing? I mean, there's a very small chance that I'm going to die in a car accident today. But because I know the devastation it would have on my family, my wife, my friends, I put on a seatbelt. Second, even if there's no chance for major environmental collapse, a premise that I'm loath to allow but maybe have to admit for tactical reasons, almost all the changes promoted by environmentalists have benefits independent of saving the planet. Maybe we can convince others who disagree with climate change that cleaner air is a good thing, so cut our emissions. Or that clean, potable water is important. So let's do what we can to stop heat evaporation and agricultural overuse. Can liberals reframe the climate change dialogue so to engage people rather than repel them when we need to work together? Can we reframe green technology as a job creator? Obama's been trying to do this. Or can we just put climate change into the context of small, sensible solutions? One former Republican conservative congressman from South Carolina, Bob Ingalls, supports some environmental elements as necessary to avoid a crisis, because he says that a crisis often leads to the growth of government. I mean, look what happened after the Depression, after World War II, after 9/11. Government soared. So let's solve it now. So we need less government bureaucracy. Maybe it'll work. But the more people we get on the environmental bandwagon, the better able we'll be able to manage this. We have to manage the message. There are plenty of ways to find common ground. So, read Bill McKibben's book. We're going to do a book discussion this summer on it. Or today, for yourself, make a commitment to talk to your neighbor where you live and join with that neighbor in one environmental project that you're going to help each other carry out. Try to think globally, act neighborly. Now, depressed enough, there's some good news. Wind turbines and solar energy is becoming more efficient. The electric car may be coming back from the dead. And I read just the other week that Philadelphia changed their street signals to LEDs and we're saving $800,000 a year in electrical costs. Well, what else can we do? It would be nice if we could all work together on this. One people, unified by identity and need to bring out the best in global crusade to save the planet. This sense of unity caused by working together with others often offers humanists a strong sense of experiencing something greater than themselves. For some humanists, they would even describe it as a form of spiritual unity with all people in the earth. But for others, they say it's simply a way to pull them out of our hyper-individualism and help them feel less lonely and more complete as social creatures. In the last part of my talk today, I want to turn towards the reality, however, that this oneness of one whole group is wonderful, but we can't ignore the differences that seem to fracture us and split the environmental movement. Because solving a common challenge has to admit differences. And ethical culture focuses on the importance of the uniqueness of every individual. We can't assume agreement over environmental matters because that matters where you live and what you own. It matters how much you are buffered from strong winds or high water or scorching sun. This is, in other words, a social justice issue. That means reaching out to others who are different than us in Philadelphia and around the world. A 2008 Oxfam report called Suffering the Science concludes that even with a massive shift of resources and consciousness right now, today, quote, the prospects are very bleak for hundreds of millions of people, most of them among the world's poorest. If there's truly an example of the tragedy of the commons, we'd all be in the same boat together. We'd all be at risk. But in the short term, at least, those least responsible for global warming are in the greatest peril. The very poor, the non-human, and the yet-to-be-born. If the seas rise, it's the poor that are going to be thirsty and hungry because their well water has become salty and their farm fields are flooded. It won't be those being served lunch on the beaches of Dubai that they are thinking of refrigerating. Putting refrigerator coils under the sand because the sand's gotten too hot. I don't know if it's really going to occur, but they're talking about it. Those people being served lunch there, and you and me are probably not going to be affected. Not at first. Who's going to be the most vulnerable to insects and malaria and dengue fever? Probably not you and me. So to move forward, we need to listen to those who are most at risk. And we have to listen to the Cassandras. Those people that we have driven crazy because we're not listening. We need to listen to a lot of things. We need to listen to the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, who gave this quote 125 years ago about other problems with our civilization, but it holds so strongly today that I want to conclude with it. We have already transgressed the limit of safety, and the present disorders of our time are but precursors of other and imminent dangers. The rudder of our ship has ceased to move obedient to the helm. We are drifting on the seething tide of business, each one absorbed in holding his own in the giddy race of competition, each one engrossed in the immediate cares and seldom disturbed by thoughts of larger concerns and ampler interests. It's time we address those ampler interests. It's time to save the planet. Thank you.